What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? The American dream is the belief that through hard work and perseverance, one can achieve success in the United States. In reality, the American dream seemed to not apply to many minorities, most notably African Americans. Despite the Civil Rights Amendments, African Americans were excluded from the promise that all men are created equal. This denial of their rights and equality inevitably drove blacks to desperation. This hopelessness provided the spark for urban riots all across 1960s America, after which some governments, including Cleveland's, were finally held accountable for the responsibility to ensure the rights of all their citizens. The Civil Rights Movement reached a turning point, with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The intended effect of these monumental laws, among many other laws of a similar nature, was to end discrimination in public programs and employment, to establish a new, more equal society.
The Civil Rights Act was sort of a catch-all act. What it did was to be able to open up accommodations in public places, to permit travel, interstate travel without interference or hindrance of any kind.
As a result of these laws, the expectations of blacks for social change greatly increased, and blacks hoped for government intervention to alleviate their problems of poverty and isolation. Unfortunately, this was not what happened. The laws were only substantially effective in the southern United States, where discrimination was not only legal, but enforced by way of the Jim Crow laws.
In the South, you were segregated by law, you were segregated by custom, and you were segregated by culture. Whereas in the North, even though the laws were a little more lenient, individuals and different organizations really made sure that African Americans stayed in their place.
The Civil Rights Act legally ended the era of Jim Crow segregation in the South, an obvious victory for the nation. However, the act proved ineffective in combating the discrimination in the North. Across the nation, discriminatory actions created circumstances of frustration and helplessness in the black community. Despite the enactment of civil rights legislation, racist practices continued in the North, fostering discontentment among blacks. The black urban community had grown substantially as a result of post-World War industrial jobs in the cities. In addition, the outmigration of whites into the suburbs, also called white flight, left cities with massive concentrations of poor blacks.
African Americans were pushed into certain parts of the neighborhoods, and then they started to, frankly, be overcrowded conditions. And then you have at the time, the predominantly white law enforcement, police, fire. And you began to see how folks began to feel that they weren't treated fairly, and the frustrations grew and grew. Then ultimately, it takes just a spark, but it had been simmering for years. And it is really about the whole issue of discrimination and segregation. Add those two together, you ultimately will have a problem.
The powder keg of black frustration first exploded in Watts, Los Angeles on August 11, 1965. After Watts, the summers in big cities across the nation from 1965 to 1967 were filled with fires and destruction, most notably in the cities of Los Angeles and Cleveland.
Hough area in Cleveland was a poverty-stricken area. It probably compared with the worst poverty in any urban city anywhere in America. Most of the time when you read about poverty, you would read about Watts in California and Hough in Cleveland. They were the two examples shown of America's worst poverty.
These cities were characterized by a destitute black population left behind in the cities by white flight, white politicians apathetic towards the suffering of blacks, and an increasing frustration of young African Americans with the slow progress of the civil rights movement. The flight of the white population into the suburbs left the Hough district of Cleveland with many of the same problems plaguing urban centers across the nation. The white population of Hough decreased by over 60% between 1960 and 1965. Hough also experienced a nearly 20% rise in the number of people living below the poverty line. Issues of unemployment, substandard housing, and poor education persisted due to the failure of the local government to uphold its responsibility to provide for the welfare of its citizens.
You had overly aggressive police officers and in some cases racist police officers that basically were unfair, police brutality. And so the government was on a daily basis reflected by the men and women in blue, particularly white males wearing police uniforms. That's what they interacted with every day that reflected government, and that wasn't a good relationship.
The Hough Riots began on Monday, July 18, 1966, because the white owner of the 79ers bar posted a sign that read, "No water for niggers." This led to a confrontation between the owner and a young black resident. Outrage over the sign, an obvious infringement of their rights, and a long-standing frustration toward government negligence and civil rights violations erupted in violence. As the violence intensified, the rioting overwhelmed the police force, whose presence further angered the rioters. The mayor of Cleveland, Ralph Locker, requested the assistance of the Ohio National Guard after the second day of rioting. With the arrival of 1,700 National Guardsmen, the violence was gradually reduced until the riots ended after 5 days of destruction.
Hough, the 2-square-mile neighborhood, erupted in violence on this day.
The white community does not take action until something of a crisis nature occurs. We had been talking to people all along about the jobs and the conditions over there. And they didn't pay any attention to us until fires broke out and people were being shot. And they came to us and said, well, what's the problem here? So the problem is what we've been talking to you all about. These people need jobs and decent housing and decent health care.
Media coverage shocked citizens across the nation. Voters, especially blacks, were galvanized into political action, and in Cleveland, Carl Stokes became the first African-American mayor of a major U.S. city. During his term, he made great improvements to Hough and other districts, beginning the Urban Renewal Project, and changed the political landscape to be more inclusive of blacks.
People were looking for an African empowerment, whether it was economic empowerment, political empowerment, and they would choose, I'm talking about an African American, they would choose a black person over a white person.
As race riots emerged in various U.S. cities, the federal government reacted to the growing national trend of urban unrest. President Lyndon Johnson established the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, later to be known as the Kerner Commission, with the mandate to both discover the causes of urban unrest and propose solutions. This commission described the differences between northern and southern racial discrimination, highlighting the more subtle racism fostered in the North for centuries. The commission also criticized the inefficiency of civil rights legislation in combating discrimination in the North, and offered solutions for the gradual erosion of discriminatory practices in northern cities. The Kerner Commission called for the integration of public workforces, including police and fire departments. This integration would give blacks the ability to obtain jobs, decent housing, and support their children's education. Thus, African Americans moved one step closer to realizing the American dream. While the Kerner Commission did obtain some of these advancements for blacks, the model put forth by the Commission was not universally adopted by all local governments, nor accepted by all the population. Even with the passing of major civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965, blacks could not overcome their inferior status in American society. The government may have changed the laws, but it could not change the mindset of many Americans. The civil rights legislation raised the expectations of many blacks for a better life, but when the laws proved unable to change the terrible realities of life, blacks resorted to extreme measures to make themselves be heard. The riots, while destroying much of the black urban community, brought more blacks into politics and subsequently allowed for the creation of programs which would improve the lives of urban blacks. The changes made in the aftermath of the riots of the 1960s, while effective in garnering national attention to the oppression of blacks, were not successful in eliminating the roots of discrimination. Even the election of Carl Stokes and other black politicians proved insufficient, demonstrating that civil rights is not an issue just for minorities. In order to make the American dream more accessible to all, efforts must be made by people of all races, classes, and statuses to usher in the equality that has been promised for over 200 years.